Today we have Kamala Mukunda and Arjun Jayadev here to discuss Kamala's book, What Did You Ask at School Today? A Handbook of Child Learning. Kamala Mukunda lives and works in a teacher-run school, Center for Learning, outside Bangalore. Apart from teaching and learning with children of all ages, she also works with teachers of government schools and teacher educators. She has created courses for teacher and education curricula. Her previous book, What Did You Ask at School Today? A Handbook of Child Learning, Book 1, has been translated into Hindi, Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam, and is used widely in teacher training settings. Arjun Jayadev is a professor of economics at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. He was previously associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He is also closely involved with the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Over to both of you.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome all. Maybe I should just begin by asking Kamala, by way of introduction to people who may not know you, you did your PhD in educational psychology in Syracuse and then moved immediately to maybe the best lab of all, which is a school. And you spent the next 20 years of your life in the school. 25, sorry. So could you tell us a little bit, over the last 10 years, you've spent a considerable time bringing together these expertise in psychology with your observations as a teacher. Can you tell me a little bit about what drew you to these kind of questions and how your experiences as a teacher really helps bring this book out?
Okay. I'll tell you the two things that I love very much. One is psychology, the subject of psychology. Are some of you psychology students, or you've done a course, or you also? I see my own psychology students here, so I know you're here. It's just a fascinating subject to me, the thought that this thing, this mind and brain that makes me function, that I know so little about how it works, but the possibility that science can tell me something about what makes me tick. So that's one big love of my life. And the other one, which I discovered quite late actually, only in my late 20s, was that I love teaching. So these two have come together for me perfectly in both these books. And maybe I'll explain a little bit more about both and why they come together for me. The thing is that research in psychology has one problematic characteristic, and that is that there's very little consensus within the field itself. Yeah? So there's very little agreement. So you'll have one set of scientists saying, IQ tests are a good measure of intelligence. And then another set of scientists, equally validly, will say, no, they're a terrible measure of intelligence, right? And this kind of thing frustrates some people, and then they say, this is too irritating, I'll go study math or physics or something. But for me, that's where my interest and excitement begins actually, with that confusion. Because I believe that questions are more interesting than answers, and that hence the title of my two books. What did you ask at school today? Because for me, questions really point to new things to pay attention to, or new possibilities. So that's from psychology. Now let's look at, suppose you're raising a child, or there's a child close to you growing up, or you're teaching a group of children. I think because we need to keep making decisions on a daily basis, we need to keep moving, we'll grab onto some answer that seems to make sense for the moment and act out of that. But then the problem is that we cling on to that answer for real life for a very long time. And maybe we feel that questions are all very well for an academic realm, but when it comes to real life, you can't be dithering, you can't be confused, you have to know what you have to do. Sure, it's true that you have to act all the time, but I think the basis of many of our actions are likely to be unexamined beliefs, unexamined assumptions. And I'm actually more interested in this question of what would it be like to act out of a question? I'm not saying I do it, but it's something that's of interest to me. Whether that action is right or wrong is kind of beside the point, because the same can be true of acting out of a conclusion. Maybe when you're dealing with young people and children, a more tentative approach might be better than something more convinced, coming from a more convinced position. So for me, these two, psychology and teaching, just came together beautifully. And I hope that I've kept that spirit in the book.
Great. I mean, when you're talking, something really struck me with this lack of consensus. So as a parent, sometimes when I'm worrying about my son or my daughter, I go to the internet and I start to look at things. And I think that apart from weight loss, there's no other subject in which there's so much advice, and I take them all if I can. But how do you go about? I mean, you're a person who's researched and you've thought through all of these things. How do you go about? How might someone who's untrained go about trying to sift through things? Because it isn't like we know nothing. It isn't like anything goes. So, and that's one of the senses that I got from reading the book. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. I'll tell you first about what I do with this lack of consensus question. Okay. So let's say I have a topic that's of interest to me and a question. And I will start reading and reading and reading. I read everything I can get my hands on that's been published or not published about this topic. And as I read, I'll swing wildly. Oh, X is true. No, X is completely false. Y is true. And it goes on for a while. But as time, it's a very maddening phase of it. But then as time goes on, I find that those oscillations are less wild. And some insights are kind of coming again and again and again, and the reading parts are leading back to the same thing. And so that clarity, that's when I feel like, okay, now can I maybe write something and share it with others. So that's my own journey. But if I think about anybody in general, as you said, a parent or a teacher who's going to Google Auntie and trying to find out something, actually we human beings are quite bad at critically evaluating claims and theories. We have, there's certain kinds of ideas that we're attracted to, and a persuasive message will target exactly that weak link in our thinking. So for example, we're biased towards ideas that offer opportunities for quick change, like in 2 weeks this will happen. We're biased, even for weight loss, we're biased towards that, right? And then we seem to like things that promise better results with less effort. This is all you have to do. And then we like things which have grand outcomes out of very small insights. It's just this little thing, and when you understand, and we really like personal, case studies. We like we like stories of the unusual and the rare. And these are just the things that blind us to everyday ordinary experience. So for me, if I was to advise somebody who's looking up things on the internet or reading it in magazines or even in the newspaper, I would say here's 3 questions you can ask of a claim. Okay? One would be, is this theory prescribing too narrowly? Is it saying you have to do this, just this and not that, at this time and not any other time, and if you don't do it, the outcomes will be irreversible? It's not true, because most things in psychology are reversible. There's almost nothing that's so clearly prescribed. Second question you can ask is, does the claim or does the theory say that there are 2 things, there are clear categories, there are 2 kinds of people, or there are 3 ways to go about it, or there are 4 stages? Again, that's probably not true, because I've learned that there's just much more complexity and continuity in human development and in psychology. So that's probably not true. And the third, I would say, is it based almost entirely on personal anecdotes and case studies? And while those may be true, I'm not saying they're not true, but they will only be a part of the story. Yeah, so I'd like to think that maybe reading a book like this, you will develop a way to evaluate what you read yourself. You'll know when to raise a red flag, and you'll know also when to acknowledge a truth. Because it is, like you said, it is out there.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I found when I was reading this book was some of the kind of cherished things which I like to believe, as you're calling it, these quick tropes, are actually not true. It was mildly disappointing, I have to say, because I always thought I wasn't as good as math as I wanted to be because I had a right brain rather than left brain, but it turns out it was my teachers who were actually Okay, one of them maybe, I don't know. But there are all these tropes that also, men learn differently from women. That's actually a very common one. And since I'm at a university, which is sort of engaging in teaching, there's also these sort of questions about, whether there are different types of learners. That's another thing that we like to believe, that there's different types of learners, and that comes from Howard Gardner, like whatever. But it turns out from your research that in fact many of those things are just sort of cherished myths. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about, how to deal with these kind of half-truths, or if at all.
Yeah. But I feel you shouldn't feel disappointed, because the truth is often actually far more interesting than. So I'll share with you a little bit about this. There is something very appealing about these narratives and these myths, right? The left brain, the right brain. But the evidence just doesn't back things up in statements in their bland form, like I have mentioned some of the questions in the beginning of this book. Every child learns differently. Yes and no. And you can write a whole chapter on this one bland statement, and the truths in that chapter are far more interesting than just every child learns differently. So it's like that. So let's take, for instance, this right brain, left brain thing. Now, it is not true that there are right brain people and left brain people, but it is true that every one of us has a left and a right brain. It also is true that the two hemispheres have very different modes of awareness and action. And both modes are available to all of us all the time. Isn't that far more interesting than, to me that's fascinating. And like this, there are many such examples in the book. Or even this thing that it's the right brain that's creative. No, creativity is a whole brain phenomenon. You can't do it with only half your brain. It doesn't work like that. I thought I'll read a little bit because... Oops. This is in a chapter on learning styles, okay? And right at the end, in the conclusion, I wrote, now that you've read through this chapter, you might be feeling a bit cheated. Like many thoughtful teachers, you yourself have said a few times, each of my students learns in a different way. And you might have hoped that this chapter would give you more insight into how to classify your students and how best to address each of their unique learning needs. Instead, it's given you the tools to critically evaluate the various learning styles' claims. I hope that this increased awareness and understanding compensates for the disappointment. As always with controversial ideas in psychology, the fun lies more in skepticism than in certainty. This chapter does not recommend a return to the one-size-fits-all classroom. You will continue to see differences between your students. Children differ in terms of their backgrounds, interests, abilities, and you must respond individually to each child in these respects. None of these are learning style differences, however, and being clear on that point will help you immensely. Also remember the point that as teachers we must use different modes of instruction in different situations. Each of us can avoid getting stuck to a single teaching style, whether it's chalk and talk, child-directed, or a bit of chaos in the classroom. Be flexible, keep changing your style. Researchers may even try to assess our individual teaching styles and classify us, but we should refuse to fall into their pigeonholes.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting that you would talk about teaching styles at this point, because I'm at a university which takes teaching very seriously. In fact, it started with the School of Education. And one thing that happens every year is syllabi are solicited, and faculty are asked to define their learning objectives. And it's always a fraught process, because faculty will respond, I want them to understand the subject. And it's always sent back saying, what do you mean? And then the faculty gets very prickly. Faculty are always prickly, but I think they get even more prickly when you ask them, so what do you mean? I know when understanding has happened. Now, when you think a little bit about that, and this is what I really started to think about when I read this chapter, it's actually really hard to kind of identify what you mean when you say your students have understood, right? And I really, really love this chapter. So I was wondering whether you could just maybe help whoever's an educator in this room to think about how to kind of give some sort of concrete understanding of understanding, a concrete sense of what it means to understand something.
I wrote in the book that I will try not to use the word understanding 3 times in the same sentence because one sentence was like that. Actually, if it's okay, could we open it, this particular question just briefly out to the audience? Anjana, is that okay? I would like to know, is there anybody here who would like to take a stab at defining understanding, or you share when you think someone has understood something, or when you have understood something? How would you describe that? Is that okay to do that now?
Mic.
Yeah, anybody. There's teachers, there's students, there's
It causes the same panic when I have to do it, but it's okay. But so you're on the spot.
How do you know when someone has understood something?
Well, I wonder if there's a difference between cognition and understanding. Because when you say the person has understood what you said, you would test them by asking questions or giving them tests. Or you sense somehow that they have understood your point of view or a particular theory.
Okay.
So I don't know if cognition and understanding can be the same, because I've also gone very far into philosophy, into Gnostic knowledge,
Yeah.
which is something completely different.
Which I know nothing about.
So it is very hard to define understanding from a scholastic educational point of view.
But you said 2 important things. You said you would test in some way,
them to
and then you
see.
said I'd get a sense. I mean,
Well,
that's about.
That is very hard to describe, because
That's about it, I think.
we are all intuitive to a certain extent other than rational beings.
Yeah.
So if a child understood 2 plus 20 equals 22, and when asked certain test questions, she would say 2 plus 20 equals 22.
Yes.
So you assume she understood.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an elusive word. I discovered it took me a whole chapter to define this one word. So I'm obviously not expecting that we do it in a rapid way, but it was more like an exploration into understanding all the different aspects of it. For me, I started out by saying, maybe I can say, if someone has understood, they should remember it. They should remember it consistently. They should apply it. And they should be able to explain it to someone else. That's just my definition, but you might have many. We are fond of saying that our tests and exams don't assess understanding, and that's the problem with the system. And so we feel so. But I would ask you, if we made a wonderful test, if our tests and exams did assess understanding, I don't think it's so easy for teachers to just switch to teaching for understanding. I think it's actually quite a subtle and difficult art. I feel that it's taken me many, many years, and I'm still in the process of improving that in myself. And actually, I think that if a teacher has this question in his mind, what is it for my students to understand? I think that's like 50% of the work, because it's a journey that teacher has to take on his own to figure it out. I again have something to read, but Arjun, would you mind, so that it's a different voice?
Sure.
I don't have to wear my glasses also. 166.
From where to where? Okay. One way of viewing understanding is as a kind of knowledge that goes well beyond facts and procedures in isolation. For most children, schooling is basically about facts and procedures, so we must be careful not to teach these in separate, isolated chunks. Every attempt must be made to build links between islands of knowledge, and students should be helped to see the connections between new facts and what they already know from their lives outside school. A story is told by an educator about students in city schools who are asked, which travels faster, sound or electricity? Many responded correctly that electricity is faster, and when asked why, replied along the lines of, my teacher said so. But one student said that sound travels faster. When asked why, he explained that when he turned on his TV, the sound came before the picture. Unfortunately, the second answer would simply be marked wrong, but it scores full marks for being connected meaningfully to the boy's real-life experience. One of my students told me, I don't know which is faster, but I think it's sound, because when my father is upstairs and he calls me, I hear his voice before I see him. their knowledge could be described as misunderstanding, which in a strange way seems preferable to no understanding at all. At least there is a reasoning process that we as teachers can catch hold of and work with. Okay. Right. So, I really like this particular example, and right through the book, there's some really wonderful examples, not only from your school, but just generally from the school, the whole process of education. And what shines through for me certainly is both your kind of love for the subject and for your subjects, as it were, right? I mean, one of the things that is quite clear to me when I'm reading this book is that you're not only engaged with them as a teacher, but also as trying to understand how it is that they're learning. And this, for those of you who are going to read this book after this, a fantastic set of discussions about how reading happens, phonemes versus graphemes. I mean, none of these things I knew about, but I'm going to talk about it like I'm an expert. But whether you actually see the word and hear it first, or whether you hear the word and see it first. And having a son who's trying to work through this, it's really kind of fascinating and sort of clarified a lot of things for me. So maybe if you could just tell me a little bit about how you maintain this sort of wonder with children, this relationship with children. Yeah.
Okay, too many of my colleagues are here, so I have to be a bit careful. Yeah. When I think about how adults relate with children, I think for some, children are kind of irrelevant to their lives because, they don't work with or live with children. But otherwise, we have this, we just love them because they're so cute, right? That's one approach we have. Then if you spend, you start spending a lot more time with them, then they get kind of irritating and they can get also exasperating. So I feel like both these attitudes are a little bit patronizing. And I've been looking for a different kind of regard that I can have for a child, which I would call respect. And it's come for me from my reading also in psychology. I would say a respect for them as complete, integral, hardworking, feeling beings, not sub-adult. If you see the language we use, even it betrays our attitudes. The words childish, juvenile, immature, they're all derogatory terms. So that's something that has come for me because of my reading. And I also think, look at how we admire and worship people who are brilliant at what they do. We just love a person who's brilliant. But children, every child is so brilliant at the kind of learning spontaneously from the world around them, right from the start. It's completely brilliant. The problem is much of what they're learning, we don't value, or we just take it for granted. Yeah, that's obvious. But it's absolutely brilliant. The kind of tremendous effort and perseverance it takes for them to learn to read, to learn a number sense, to learn language, for that matter. So I wanted to read a bit from the first book, actually, on this. Just a second. Yeah, this is the chapter on child development, and just briefly. Everyone agrees that children are cognitively immature. Developmental psychologist David Bjorklund believes that this immaturity serves important functions for normal development. Childhood is a necessary period of growth and maturation. Human beings have developed culture and society to such a degree that children need a long period of dependence on adults so that they can absorb and learn all the knowledge and skills they need to survive later in life. Compared to our closer relatives among the apes, human children spend many more years in relative immaturity, physical, sexual, and cognitive. Bjorklund's focus is on the last of the three. According to him, we might see cognitive immaturity in children as a kind of deficiency, something that needs to be remedied through experience and teaching. But there is another way to see it. Cognitive immaturity may serve a necessary function in child development. It may even be that some of the inabilities of childhood are in fact better seen as qualitatively different abilities, useful in structuring experience and therefore learning during childhood. A simple example is the fact that babies do not have 20/20 vision and remain quite myopic for the first few months. This reduces the amount of information they have to deal with while making sense of the world. And further, since they can focus best on objects about a foot away, they are able to make eye contact with their mother during feeding. So it would not make sense to give little babies custom-made spectacles so that they can see better. I just want to show you, to tell you that my illustrator Radhika Neelkandan, she's not here now, she's my colleague. She draws just brilliantly. I don't know if you can see that one, the little baby with the spectacles.
Yeah, so, I mean, when you were saying this, I was just reminded of another chapter that was personally very meaningful to me, which was the chapter on learning difficulties. So, I have a child who was diagnosed when we were in the US as having ADHD, later dyslexia, other things, ODD. Now, there was this concern in the West that when we were in the West, oh, this is something that is just labeling. There's nothing real to it. But there is something clearly to us. It was clear that there is something about learning difficulties, and whether it's in learning difficulties in terms of behavior or reading, there is something real that, especially in India, I feel that we often sort of brush aside. So the chapter was very meaningful to me. But maybe you could speak a little bit about your sense about how learning difficulties have been thought about, especially in the Indian context, and how, as educators, one should go about thinking about these things.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not an expert on the history of how learning difficulties and attention management difficulties has been seen in India. I think there are people right here who would be better to answer that part. But I would like to say that, first of all, these difficulties are not a passing phase. Okay? And they are real, they are located in the brain. And they're not a matter of, just a little more effort or just a better attitude or just some more motivation. Okay, so what will happen if we are in denial of a child's real difficulty? That's what you're asking, no? Just as a thought experiment, let's take something that's kind of away from this topic and a little simpler maybe. Let's say you have a child who's tone deaf. They're just not musically inclined, but you decide that you're going to put him or her into music classes, and all the way hoping for a musical career. Okay. What is likely to happen? How is that likely to play out? No one has a mic, otherwise it would be nice to hear from you. How is that likely to play out?
The child starts hating music.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. That's all I meant. Yeah. Starts hating music, yeah. But so as time goes on, I think at some point it will be realized that this is probably not the right career for this child, and it'll drop away, but it won't destroy anything in the child's life. It's okay, there are other things to do. It's not a disaster. So I think this is the difference with reading or with writing and arithmetic difficulties. I've talked a lot in the book about this notion of a disorder and whether it is correct to call these disorders or not. Yeah? Any parent wants their child to have good health. And if you're going to call this a disorder, it means my child is ill in some way, and I don't want to think about it like that, right? So is it even right to call these disorders? After all, being musically challenged is not considered a disorder. In fact, when we say tone deaf, it's just a descriptive term. It doesn't imply anything more, right? But so if you look at children with difficulty reading, I can imagine a world where that wouldn't matter, isn't it? Yeah? In fact, 100% literacy for the whole population is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's maybe 100 years. Well, for the whole population, very recent. Yeah. And I don't even think reading is core for the human experience. Others may feel differently, but I think you can lead a perfectly fulfilled and happy human existence life without reading. But the way we have structured society today, it's not the case. A child who has difficulty reading will suffer in school and beyond. And if we don't face that fact for that child, then we may be denying her or him the necessary attention, the necessary understanding. Yeah. So there's actually a lot more to this topic. It was very, very intricate. So I'd urge you to read about it here, elsewhere. It was one of those that I had the most questions about when I started to read about it.
You know, you mentioned just now about things which are happening quite, which are different, if you will, in as I was saying, where my son was diagnosed when we were in the States. Here, it's in a different sort of environment. I want to just shift focus a little bit to a theme that's there throughout the book, but isn't quite very explicit, which is unusual for us, because very often many of the messages we are getting are really from Western schools and Western books. But the question of the Indian context, one of the things that I've found interesting as being on the other side at the end of the school process is that still in India there's a sense of the school process as being quite hierarchical, broadly subservient. That's not, of course, that's changed over the last 20-25 years. It's clearly not the way it used to be from all the stories I've heard. But there is still that sense that there's a lack of freedom, if you will, for students to have this question, what did you ask at school today? It's more sort of fed to them, right? So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts broadly for the Indian education in general. I know that this is a very broad topic, but what does the research that you've been looking at seem to suggest for how we might be thinking about our educational system more broadly?
Can I answer the first part? You said something about the Indian context and bringing that into the two books. Yeah, because this was a real problem for me with this subject, psychology. It is a very Western-centric subject. All the papers, all the authors, a lot of the theories, everything is coming from there. And that was a big problem for me. And I have tried to address it in different ways, and I've also written about how I solved that in my head. Also in India, psychology is an art subject. It's BA, MA psychology. In the West, it's a science subject. In India, I find that many people don't understand. Like those who think of it as an art subject, well, scientists will say, well, that's a humanities subject. And those who are in the humanities will say it's a science, and we don't. So we fall between the cracks. I feel sad about that. But I hope that will change as more of my students take up psychology and make waves in Indian psychology. That would be nice. Then you asked about change in education in India. Actually, coming from Azim Premji University, you should be telling us, maybe you could share a little bit about that later. But so if I think about change, it's like a mindset change, that we need. And mindset changes are very difficult to make happen. I know many good people working in this field. They're working very creatively, but things are pretty resistant to change. And at all levels. Let's say you take an individual teacher who's very moved to make a difference. But very soon he'll find that, curriculum, assessment, school policy just stifle him and he can't do much. And then even if the system, like the National Curriculum Framework, 2005, they make beautiful, enlightened statements of how education should be. Okay, but then on the ground, you'll still find people saying, that's fine, but I'm just going to go on as I always have. So it is very difficult. I feel like we need a whole army, a small army of young people to enter the system at all levels, teaching to administration, and practice and preach and be curious and eager to learn and make a big difference. And I think that's what Azim Premji Foundation University is.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to speak for the foundation. This is about you, but I just want to I do want to say that I agree. It's a very odd thing about our country that we say our biggest strength is our people, and then we say, but we won't educate them well. we don't say that. We say they're the best in the world, of course. But it is true that there is a big problem that we have this generation of young people who are not being, in some sense, educated for the purpose. I'm not even sure exactly what that means. And maybe the respect that education and teaching had 100 years, 50 years ago as a profession, I'm not sure that continues to date. The village schoolmaster isn't anymore as respected as they used to be. So it's really a sort of cultural change that I think, and I agree with you, it has to be sort of a huge effort to change the system, especially given the kind of things that you're saying. But it's an interesting thing because it brings me to the next question that I had.
Wait one second, Arjun, I want to say something else. I was at Azim Premji University some months ago, and after dinner, there was a small informal session with undergraduates who might want to become teachers, and I thought there may be 4 or 5 of them, but there were like 30 of them sitting there, and I just felt so happy. I thought, wow, and I asked them, are you just here? Just, why are you here? Do you really want? And many of them said, yeah, we're considering it. So there's something right happening then, if young people are interested enough to think. Because when I was young, the school teacher was the last thing I wanted to be. She was the most unlikable and unlovable person. So if that's changing, then we don't have to worry about this, the school teacher not having society's respect. It's these young people who feel excited that this might be a fun thing to do, Yeah, sorry.
So no, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, given the fact that we have a lot of people to educate and we have, if you want, this kind of human capital bottleneck, one of the things that, at least for the last 20, 25 years, we have been promised is that somehow technology is going to solve these problems. We're going to have computers in actually now I can remember literally 20 years, 1 laptop per child. Every 2-3 years, there's something new that was going to solve the problem through a technological focus. I note this at the same time that I think that technology is actually being used in much, much, much more intrusive ways in our lives on a day-to-day basis, and yet it doesn't seem to be kind of there for the educational purpose. So it's an interesting kind of conjuncture at this moment, and you have spent a little bit of time talking, at least in the book, thinking about, if you will, digital learning. So
the longest chapter.
Yes, so maybe you can just speak a little bit about that chapter.
Yeah, I actually believe that if we were not doing a good job before digital technology, we're not going to do a good job with it. I'll just say a little bit more about that. And the other way around also, like good teachers of the past, I don't think they were fundamentally hampered by their lack of digital digitech in the classroom, as it's called. But see, this thing in itself is not a reason not to use it. I'm not saying that one should shun it. If it can be used creatively by a teacher who knows it well and knows its strengths and weaknesses, and why not? Any tool that a teacher uses in a classroom creatively, it can't go wrong, can't go far wrong, right? So that's as a tool. I just don't think it's going to solve everything, nor do I think it's going to spoil everything. That's one. The other use of Digitech is just as a simple replacement of a traditional tool, like students can use tablets instead of notebooks, and teachers can use smart boards instead of blackboards. Again, I'm neither terribly excited nor terribly anxious about this. Everything will have its advantages and disadvantages, and it'll just keep going on, and that's fine. But the one thing that really makes me think hard and worry and all that is the idea that Digitech can replace the teacher. Obviously, being a teacher, that's very threatening to me. So I am biased in favor of human interaction in the process of teaching and learning. I mean, there's just no two ways. Recently, somebody sent me a story about this small, it's about this size, a round thing that you put in front of the child. They press it. It says, it speaks to the child. It says, hello, what is your name? And then and she says her name, the student says her name. It recognizes the name. It says, how are you today? And they showed me this thing, and I was thinking, and right next to her is a teacher, sitting right next to her. So the whole thing was a bit bizarre for me, that why do we need this thing? It just almost feels as if it's new, so let's play with it. I don't know. Of course, I don't mean in situations where you can't have a teacher or where, you don't have access to, then online courses are wonderful. I know people who learn from them, maybe for older learners. So all digital technology comes with caveats, and I'll just read a couple of sections. Yeah, so in this chapter I describe a very fascinating, fantastic project actually that was done some years ago. It's called Kids as Global Scientists, and I describe how they use the internet to put children in touch with scientists all over the world to learn all about global weather, climate and weather. So it's a fantastic project. And then I said that not all projects are like this. Not all projects using digital technology are like this. Okay, and this represents an exception rather than the norm. Most students have more passive than creative experiences with digital media. Look at this hypothetical example. A teacher decides to cover one chapter of the biology syllabus using digital media. She finds a few good videos to show her students. Then she divides the classroom into smaller groups and assigns each a question for internet research, such as, what are the parts of a plant that give us our edible vegetables? Students create portfolios and PowerPoint presentations to share with the rest of the class at the end. Now, this kind of project is quite easy to do, but one must be careful not to sacrifice real learning and engagement for time spent sitting at a computer. It's easy to slip into passive watching or cut-paste kinds of tasks. Schools all over the world, including city schools in India, routinely encourage children to do homework using the internet. However, without training in how to use net resources, students might fall into many frustrating traps online. Educator Wendy Sutherland Smith surveyed Australian middle school students' use of internet sources and found them confused on several points. For example, 1. Should I read a web page from start to finish? Or should I scan quickly? Should I use snatch and grab methods to save text and sites for later close reading? What keywords should I use to search for information? There's too much information, too many links. How do I know what to select? A 10-year-old student tells Sutherland Smith, I work hard all the class, but at the end the net has given me nothing. At least this child had a sense of something lacking. Many students probably feel that they're producing a lot of content because cut-paste gives them that feeling. It gives me that feeling too. Students' use of the net can vary widely in quality, so you as their teacher must maintain a high standard for their work and teach them how to meet it. In 2002, Douglas Levin and Susan Arafe did a landmark survey of hundreds of students in the US, exploring their use of the internet to support their learning. My favorite quotes are two that show the promise and the danger of internet homework. The first one, I still use books, but combining them with the information found online is what makes them valuable, because once textbooks are printed, the information in them becomes increasingly more stagnant, whereas with the always lively and ever-changing internet, recent discoveries in any academic topic are readily available. Okay, I found that quite impressive. And the other one, sometimes I'll find essays on the internet that match essay topics from school. I don't totally plagiarize them, but usually I will change the words and just take the overall ideas in them. So both things happen. And one more thing I'll read from this chapter about much younger children and devices. One fear with young children using digital devices is that they may spend so much time with it that less time is left over for other kinds of play and social interactions. This is so similar to earlier concerns about young children and TV watching. Personal digital media cannot contribute to the development of many faculties of a child's mind and body. That old-fashioned word holistic comes to mind. Especially in primary school, sources of knowledge and information should be rooted in observing and interacting with other people, physical objects, and the natural world. Young children are primed to learn from their everyday experience with these things and to become intuitive experts in psychology, physics, and biology. To substitute these real worlds for the screen is to short circuit learning curves that have evolved over millennia. We don't know what we're missing. Ironically, a clue to what might be missing from the sophisticated digital screen experience is given in this report. It's called the Ready to Learn report about kids using iPads. And it's given as a positive feature. Just listen to this. Apps provide children opportunities to participate in digital activities that would otherwise make a mess or get them into trouble, like splashing water in a pond or making cupcakes.
Okay. Well, okay, so maybe I want to move to the other end of the schooling spectrum, more students who in the end come to me, okay, and when I'm as an undergraduate. And it seemed to me that there was a time when schooling was relatively simple, at least in its aims. You were aiming to get someone a job at the end of all of this, and some way to face the world, some morals, whatever it was. Moral science, there used to be classes like moral science, right? But it seems to me that right now the world is far more complex. Jobs are much more tenuous. There's a much greater volatility, if you will, in the world than in the past. And it seems to me that increasingly what students often need, of the young people who come to me often need, is just resilience, a certain sense of resilience and adaptability. And I'm just wondering, when you're thinking about schooling, how can we think about orienting schooling towards this kind of need, to be resilient, adaptable, as well as have all these skills, and I actually believe in some sense a moral orientation towards the world. And I just wanted to ask you this because that's in some way part of the theme of the book, but also sort of asking in the end, this larger question about resilience.
Yeah, I would say I haven't touched upon that. Actually, it's an extremely important question. I don't think I've touched upon it. And I would, given that there are so many teachers here, is this a question that we can open out to Anjana? Is it something we can open out to? So, just to recapitulate what you're asking.
So, how do you orient education towards resilience, adaptability, what you need?
Yeah.
Someone who hasn't yet spoken, anyone there?
I guess many of the things you have covered, like starting with observation or many of these things, and there's no need to teach anything to anybody. I mean, if they are just observing, learning in the process, there are challenges around. So while figuring out solutions to those challenges, they are learning, understanding. Automatically these will be part of that learning process. And in these challenges, there will be many times some things which do not work out. So automatically they have to figure out another way to do it. They may go wrong. All those things will be part of this journey. And if that is the process which is followed from the earlier age, which can be just instead of this structured classroom, structured syllabus, structured examination oriented education, if there is more of, or maybe if we can work out a semi-structured way, because probably people are not willing at this point to leave that structure right away. And then in this process, we are focusing more on these skills than the content or whatever is there or whatever we want somebody to learn or understand about. It is just more than focusing on the skills rather than any of these content.
Actually, learning from mistakes, I think, is a great way to build resilience and adaptability. And when I think about it, like, we are not structured to help children learn from mistakes, right? Because we become too invested in their success. Like even in a classroom, we want children to succeed, score certain marks, show to the world that the school is doing well. I don't know, whatever. So then, like, we don't let the children fail at all. We somehow, like I see, like in conventional schools, starting from a very young age, I see teachers are trying to kind of, if they are not able to write, they hold the hand of the child and make them write. I mean, these are like simple acts that we do as teachers to make sure that the children appear to have succeeded. So then, like, where is this? Even as a parent, like I being a parent of a 16-year-old, somewhere, like as a parent, you become invested in their success. Like, unless you're very conscious and you're catching yourself and giving those opportunities to learn from mistakes, I feel the resilience, adaptability is very hard to build in a child. So, yeah.
I know we are all going by unstructured and not structured and things like that. But we are 3 facilitators here who work in Vidyaniketan with a subject called life skills. And we start right from first and go up till the 12th. And the whole thing has been very fluid. We haven't had a sort of structure or a syllabus for any grade. But the point here has been to take a particular topic and expose the child to it via storytelling, maybe with the book or on the active board or something that's happening right now in the world, and facilitate the opening of the subject. Then the children come up with questions, and by the end of the topic, you have a learning. I'll give you an example. So we are doing Helen Keller with children in primary. So we're talking about children learning to be empathetic to, other people. So we started with something like having the children close their eyes and close their ears. And it was just astounding how children came up with, oh my God, how did they hear? How did they learn? How did they, how did this lady? So the thing is, sometimes things like resilience or even, just the concept of not giving up, or honesty, all these things which we learned as moral science as we were growing up are probably things that cannot be taught. But you have to facilitate the child to think and become aware. And we don't have assessments for this subject. So like you were asking that question, how do you know when the child has understood? So all of us in our department bank on the hope and the pray that one day it's going to strike them somewhere. But we are very persistent with our method. We try to keep it as much, as hard as it is, but we try to keep it very fluid, and it has to come from the child. There's no teaching. So the whole thing is on what have I learned in the end, and what have I come up with, and there's nothing wrong. It's all right. It's from their perspective. So we leave it at that, maybe visit it back again. So
Lovely. Thank you.
Okay, so, I know that people probably want to ask questions. I'm going to ask one last question, As teachers, we're not supposed to have favorites. But I do, and if any of my students are here, it's you. Okay, but I want to ask you really about your favorite chapter. Right? I know that there are I mean this honestly. It's really an extraordinarily wonderful book. I read it in about 4 or 5 hours, but I'm going to read it again and again, and I know that my colleagues will as well. So, but I wanted to ask, in all these beautifully written and researched chapters, what was the one that maybe you liked the most, and what was the most fun one to do?
The one on attention. Easy answer. Because I got to use a lot of analogies and I had a lot of fun with it, and Radhika and I, the illustrator, we had a lot of fun with the illustrations for that one. So that was the most fun. But actually the two that I learnt the most working on, like that most scratched my own itches, were the one on digital education and the other one on learning difficulties. And those two, I felt that I got so much more clarity that I didn't have before, and that I tried to faithfully, communicate in simple terms for readers. Simple but not simplified, because it's very complicated, both of them. Yeah.
Okay, so I think you probably have lots of questions and so on. I don't know how you normally do this. Do we take questions in a group, or I think the floor is open to ask Kamala any questions about the book.
In the digital topic, I was wondering what you thought of this idea of the flipped classroom, which kind of seems to combine, at least to me, I found it very impressive because it combines the power of digital technology with the idea that interaction and human contact are important.
Yeah, you mean this thing where, just correct me if I'm wrong, where you can give, for instance, Khan videos for home viewing, and then they learn to some degree at home, and then when they come to class, you as the teacher can facilitate discussions around it, or challenge questions, or they can say what they didn't understand, and so on.
And also individual, one-on-one.
I think it's great. Like I said, if I wouldn't mind trying something like that for a little while. But it's interesting, I read and I wrote about a couple of studies which were commissioned by, was it the Gates Foundation? I don't know, but to find out how well the Khan videos are being used. And both those studies, one was in South America, one was somewhere else, the teachers were very careful about how to use it. They felt they wanted to introduce the concept. They wanted to be the ones to introduce the concept. And I'm not sure if it's just us wanting to have that control, or they tried it and they felt that it was better that way. Yeah, does that answer the question? It sounds an interesting idea, and anything can be, like I said, try it. But it all rests on whether, as a teacher, you are fully committed. You're not using it as a shortcut, can I put it that way? And using it because you're burdened and you don't have time, or you're giving up. If you're going to use something creatively, it can't go wrong. Because you will quickly see if something is not happening and you'll fix it.
Sorry, I wanted to jump in because I have taught with a flipped classroom, and it went very, very wrong. I taught one class, and I thought I would do this, and gave all the videos to the students and said, come and we'll discuss it if you have problems. And not one of them watched the video from the first class. That's probably me, but clearly these kind of things require a lot of thought and.
Actually, now if I think of it, I do it, but not with the technology. I will give a chapter and say, read it and we'll discuss in class. Even that doesn't really work. But if you give the work with a worksheet. So like if I say, watch this video, Arjun, you could have tried this. Watch this video and answer these questions. Then it forces them to process that differently. The problem with the video is it won't stop when a student's eyes are glazing over, and it won't stop and say, did you get that? Although the more sophisticated, learning tutors, they're getting better and better now, actually. By which time I would have retired, so I don't have to worry. But yeah.
Hi. I had two questions. One was on, I was very fascinated when you said that you don't think reading is a really required skill for an adult or full human experience. But what would you say are those skills required for, let's say, a full human experience?
Are you serious?
No, in the sense of what, because we've been reading about this, and one of the things that came up was OECD has come up with a list of skills that 21st century requires, and like critical thinking, creativity, things like that. But one of the things that keeps coming back is if they don't know to read, how they even explore further. But I'm fascinated with what you said. That was one question. And the other I had was, do you think what you have found in your studies, and I know you have been focusing on the children, but also that it applies to adults in a learning space?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Okay, and especially because I work with adult and mostly differently educated women and rural women, and I say differently educated. It's new for us to use those terms because we find them to be educated, but just in a different way.
Yeah.
But I'm fascinated. I mean, I'm really interested to know that if it does apply. So, what are those things that really apply to an adult? And especially because you said that nothing is irreversible, and that was also really nice to hear. That there is always, I mean, there's never a
Yeah,
you're a
you
gone
can
case.
go back, unlearn, relearn, definitely.
Yeah.
So about the first one, I can't. I'll just clarify what I meant when I said reading isn't core to the human experience. Yes, if you decide I'm not going to read, you will lose out on a lot of things in today's world. Yes, but what I meant is more like to be a human being is to be related, maybe to have a relationship with nature, with other people. In that sense, I can imagine a world where it was there, no, some 100 years ago, where you didn't have to know to read to live a good life. In that sense, and I know people near the school where we live who don't read, and I don't think that their life is less in any way. In that sense, I meant. But I'm not saying that if I find a child in my class who's having difficulty reading, that I'm going to say, that's fine, you don't need it. No, I will make efforts because of the milieu that she or he is growing up in and the kind of life and lifestyle that, I will make efforts and attempts to get that child to be able to read. So that was about that. Then you were saying adult learners. That's fascinating. I haven't read about this, and I don't. There must be a whole body of literature about the adult learner. I suspect it's probably not as well researched, of course, as child learning. But my general understanding is there's a continuity, not a discontinuity, in the sense the way that children learn, like she said, cognitively acquire information and process it, it may be very similar to the way adults do. And we can keep learning right up till the day we pop it. We can keep on learning. There is no, we tend to think that it's like, oh, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or I'm too old, I can't learn. I don't know about physically, but definitely here you can. So I would be interested to know more about what you're doing with adult learners. I don't yet know a lot about that.
Hi. So having accepted and acknowledged that from a young age, there are no gender differences in what a child is interested in learning. As a teacher, how do you tackle the time when you start to observe that young girls are getting more attracted to so-called girly things and boys to I mean, should you force that to stop, or what would you do?
I don't know about force, because if you say no, don't play with that, or don't, it'll confuse them. But I think we should all be looking at the many subtle and gross forces of conditioning around us. It is incredible. The research shows, and also I see how the way we respond to girls and boys. In my own class, I know I do it. I realize I'm doing it, and I have to stop myself. The way I address girls or boys, it is different. It's, I think the first thing is to be very humble in the face of this strong conditioning. One thing that might, if you're talking about science and math and that chapter, one thing that would be nice is I have many students who are here actually who were very good in math and science throughout, but they have chosen to do something different in their life, be it dance or education or something else. Maybe one would counsel them a bit more at the time they're making their decision and talk to them about why. Are you clear? Could it be that you think that that's not a female pursuit? Maybe one should counsel more at that age. I have one student who I think underperforms seriously because she's in a class with two boys. And suddenly it struck me, and I asked, are you doing this because of that? Can you just look at it and see if that's happening? Maybe it's a question but at a younger age, if a girl wants to go and play with dolls, I'm not going to force them not to, or say don't or something.
Yes. So I study at the Azim Premji University, and I'm a math major. So my love for maths has made me volunteer at the Math Resource Center at college. And for a while I was attending just to relearn what I learnt in school in a different manner and see how differently it can be taught, because I don't think I had a very broad education in that sense. So this once the instructor asked me to help out by explaining to my classmates, because I'm doing math, I should have a good idea of it enough to explain to others. And I ended up explaining something wrong to her. She didn't return to the Math Resource Center. I hope that's not my fault. But given the fact that I'm in a room full of educators, I figured I'd take advantage and ask you, what do you do when you mess up?
Luckily for me, my students have to keep coming back every Monday. there is no, not coming back. And I just admit it. The minute I know it's happened, I just admit it. I just say, sorry, I goofed. And it happens quite often. When you're teaching like maybe 8 hours a day, it's going to happen a lot. I think if you have an affectionate relationship with your students, that's not, and their regard for you is not contingent on your knowing everything and not making mistakes, then this is not a problem. Sorry, I can't see you. It's not a problem. Just admit it and carry on. Just one funny story. It's in middle school, the children think that you cannot make mistakes and stuff like that. But then soon, a little bit after that, it crashes. It all comes crashing down quite hard, actually. And then you have to spend the next few years trying to get back some manam.
They were not hearing me but watching the
Quite like.
Makes them come to class and listen.
Hello, ma'am. So I think there was a discussion on the education system and all those things. So considering that like most of the schools have the strength of around 45 or 50 in a class, and there is a lot of constraint on the covering the syllabus and getting good marks and all those things. And then again there are the discussions like learning the skills about the adaptability or other skills, critical thinking or 21st century skills or whatever we talk about. How should, as a teacher should balance between these two things? So I just want to know your opinion or suggestions that how can we tackle this problem and work out some solution.
It's a question that we get asked quite often. One thing about the question is, I feel like the questioner is holding many things constant and saying, this won't change, this won't change, this won't change, but I still want to do a better job. And that maybe, what if that's just a wrong question? What if some of those things have to change to make it better? You can't say, I will have 45 children, but I want to have relationship with them. It may not be possible. So that's just one thought. Sorry, I just lost the other thought. I'll come back to you if I remember. You asked, just repeat the question. You asked, what can we do? Yeah. So, my other thought is this, that I feel that if as a teacher, you're just on fire with this need to do it differently, I feel you will find your solutions. And if for me to say, I am lucky I have class sizes of 8, 9, for me to think of ways for you to do it differently, it's kind of presumptuous, it's arrogant. I actually don't know the challenges that you are facing in that class. But if you are on fire with that, you will find a way. I really feel, there was a time when I was teaching like 100 in a class and 80, this was in college. And I somehow figured out a way to learn every single name in the class. And I figured out a way to, call them by name and make a connection. You'll do it if you want to, I feel. But there does have to be support from school administrators, for example. That kind of support has to be there.
Yeah, I agree with you that if someone is very much passionate about it and there is a fire which is burning, then they will find out the solution. But I will tell that why this question triggered. So we work with many schools and like with the teachers on building the skills and how can we tweak the syllabus little bit and being in the curriculum, what can we do to improve the skills like observations and all the thinking and whatever. Every time we get the same thing, that we have so much syllabus to cover, students should get the marks and all those things. So we are trying to figure out the solutions, but I thought that because you are from that field, if you can give some suggestions, it would be.
This is exactly what we also hear when we go out and do workshops and things. They will listen to you and then they will say, but I can't do this. I just feel like that first step itself is wrong. If they wanted to, they say, oh, and many people do that. This is very interesting. I'm going to go and try something in my school. There are people who do that too. So too much of asking other people for solutions I think that may be the mistake. Yeah. Just could you tell the name of your organization?
We are from Seed to Sapling Education. So
say again?
Seed to Sapling Education.
Seed to Sapling.
So a couple of us from ISC after doing PhDs, because there was a group called Notebook Drive. We were working, volunteering for the schools. We thought that of doing that, so we thought we will give it a chance.
That's really good. I just feel like you would have inspired many people, but you will not get them all.
Yeah,
even 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10.
That's what we are trying to.
Thank you, Dr. Kamala. I feel so privileged. I want to be your student. My neighbors were making fun of me and saying, are you 5 or 50? So I said, I'm 4. So anyway, what I wanted to say was positive motivation reinforcement in school, young learners, is important, which is lacking in many schools, because they will negatively say something harsh and the child will be in agony for many years, and that is one thing. Second thing is creative thinking is not a part of our curriculum. I mean, they may learn some dance, they may learn some drawing, but to think creatively is absent, even among teachers, professors. So creativity has taken the back burner in our society. Everything is math and science and getting exams and getting more and more money and so on. So the purpose of education, of humane development, human self-development is absent. With consciousness of the society, global consciousness, it's absolutely not. They're in very few schools, I would say, the top notch. So what should we do about it? And how can we inspire children to be creative? You probably know of Edward de Bono. I've been reading him since I was a child. So how can we be creative? How can we be global conscious, social conscious, and sense of adaptability and flexibility in thinking? How can we allow young learners to, because I'm a creativity coach for children. So I'm myself very creative, so I can help inspire them. And I feel like a child when I'm with children. So I like that. And I wish I was your student. Thank you.
You know the answer to that question better than I do, because you're a creativity coach. Just one thing, that creativity can come in many more realms than we currently think of, right? We think of it in the arts, but you can be very creative in a math class. You can be very creative with a science experiment, and you can be very creative in your relating. Like, maybe all your classmates are gossiping about somebody or something, and you can have a creative response to that and not just do what everybody else does. So maybe we need to define it as being possible in every aspect of our lives. But do you want to say something?
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement. Definitely to put a child down is a mistake, but to boost them up or pump them up with praise. I've talked a bit about that in the first book, that it can really go wrong also. There are many times when children know that praise is insincere and you're only doing it to make them feel good about themselves, and they distrust it. They don't really like it. So we have to be careful about I think acknowledging hard work, acknowledging, good intentions and effort, or even a nice solution or a nice painting, that's fine. But praise, or to build a person who's good at something, like an image of a person who's good at something. It's like building a straw man, and then the next person who comes and says, "Oh, that's a horrible essay," then then it's horrible. I mean, the person feels destroyed.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this genderized conditioning that you referred to earlier. So it's kind of interesting that, for instance, when I was growing up, which is 50 years ago, there were no disincentives for girls to do well in science. I mean, if we did well, it was appreciated. Although in the urban middle class setting that we came from, overall society was more gendered than, you saw less men cooking and all those things. And it was a bit of a shock to me that when I went to the US, I realized that their high school students, there was a huge disincentive for girls to do well in science because they were seen as less sexy and all of those things. And now it seems like the trend here also is reversed in some sense, as in what was seen in the US 40 years ago, 30 years ago is now beginning to be seen here. So, and people attribute it to whatever, TV and the stereotyping that messages that people get on a very extensive scale and all that. So I was wondering, is there any pedagogy that has been developed to counter this sort of conditioning at the high school stage? Because recently there was a study that somebody did in Dehradun for schools, and she found that high school students, the girls were actually interested in science, but the boys thought that the girls were not interested in science, and they thought that the girls did not take science because science is too difficult for them, and so on and so forth. So, the seeding happens in boys at a very young age, and so on. So, is there a pedagogy to counter this?
So, by pedagogy, you mean something we can do while we're teaching,
not
just attitudes, but actually it's very interesting that they say that if you teach spatial skill, spatial reasoning in school, which we don't actually do, we don't deliberately teach it, it's not part of the curriculum. There's some nice examples of that. Then you would level the playing field for girls and boys, because they also say that that kind of training it actually improves spatial reasoning skills. It works, and also that spatial reasoning is one of the correlates for doing well on entrance exams for STEM courses. So pedagogically, that's the only thing I can think of that I have heard about. But the other thing you mentioned was about this disincentive. By that you mean that
sort of society putting pressure on girls to do quote-unquote girly things, as somebody said, rather than...
and also for a boy not to do, like for instance, when they come to the 11th and they want to choose history, psychology, sociology, I wish that the boys would also feel that freedom to do sociology and so for this thing, there have been some very nice books recently in the last few years. There are some people here who are experts on children's books. You can say books on girls in science, girls that have done, women who've invented things. There's some beautiful books out there, maybe.
Those are not typically given to boys. They are typically given to girls as role models and all of that. They're not given to boys to think that it's normal for women to do science. So I was sort of wondering whether there's something in the teaching that can counter those trends.
Maybe in the hiring you should make sure you hire only women faculty in science departments.
I'm also from C2 Sapling, so because we work with many schools, I have some observations. So when I ask a 6th class, do we breathe air or oxygen? Most class will say we breathe oxygen. If I ask the same question in 7th class, most class will say we breathe air. And if I ask the same question to 8th class, they'll almost think of me stupid, that why am I asking such a question? I'm just curious what is happening in this small time frame, right? 6 to 7 and 7 to 8. So, and my second question is again about gender differences in classrooms. So, when we work with a 5th to 7th class, girls and boys are equally participative in the classroom. And from 8th, somehow girls just don't talk, at least in the school that we have been working with, or they talk very less. And I don't know if it's just a correlation, but at least what I have observed is, until 5th to 7th, girls and boys sit together on one bench. And suddenly from 8th, girls are a different section in the classroom, boys are a different section in the classroom. So I don't know if it's a correlation or from 8th standard there is something happening in hormones. Yeah.
Your first question was about what is the change? I don't know, but maybe they're learning something about it in those classes.
Directly, no one has taught anything.
They haven't, is it?
No one directly has told them, no, you're not reading.
I don't know of any research that says that this is such a specific thing which you're saying happens. But there are developmental changes in how children understand the world. I mean, and if this is an example of that, I don't know. But this thing about, it used to bother me a lot more, and sometimes it does, even now, when girls and boys who used to play happily together, suddenly they sit separately and they do things. But then I know they'll come back again together. I mean, so maybe one just leaves it. Maybe that is also a developmental stage, and it's as long as no one's unhappy in that experience. It is a pity. You feel sad. Oh, that friendship would have been nice, but it's not going to happen for some years. But it does come back.
So are there any other questions? Okay, so sorry. So I'd like to end by actually just saying a couple of words. I'm awfully biased about this book, partly because my first teacher of statistics 27 years ago was Kamala, and so any left brain that I had was partly due to her. But I modulo the biasedness. This was really, after a very long time, a book that I read where I felt like there was such a depth of expertise and really a teacher talking to you. You know, it was one of these things when you've all had the experience when you've had a teacher really explain something to you and it really comes to you. You really understand. And it's actually a marvel of a book. Both of these books are marvelous books because in some sense you have this deep learning which is coming to you in a way that really only a teacher can teach you. So I'd like to thank Kamala not just for this talk but for writing these books and for helping me all these years. All right.
Thank you so much.